So have you been back to Elon since you graduated?
Yes. Well, fun fact about me is I grew up in the town of Elon. I grew up in this very town, a mile and a half up the road probably. So I come back plenty to see my family. So yeah, that was sort of an interesting thing, going to college somewhere so close to home. But yeah, I'm from here. I definitely will always be close to Elon by the sheer fact that my parents live in this town.
Yeah, so as you've come back and visited, you've seen kind of like the School of Communications, Elon, grow, and then being a student yourself, you've also like reported, I know, on some of like the new additions that they were building back in 2013, 2012. Can you like talk about that?
Yeah, I mean, well, I remember when I was in student media here was when they were announcing the iMedia program, as they called it, the graduate program. And that was when there was conversations about growing the School of Communications and expanding on from EQN and what would that look like. So I certainly got a seat while I was a student here, and then in my first job, which just happened to be at the Times News in Burlington, some of the changes that were going on at Elon. And I've certainly seen the growth here just from coming in, doing walks around the campus when I was here visiting family. But I mean, it's an incredible facility now. There's, obviously way more space for students to create, more studio space, more space to work in the Pendulum. At one time, we were in a tiny room in the basement of McEwen by the screening room. And then at one point we were moved across the street into the Elon Town Center. At one point we were housed in a bank that had an old vault.
Really?
And so the Pendulum was being moved around because there was so much construction going on. There were so many changes. And so while the School of Communications was growing, the Pendulum was a little nomadic. So I saw many different versions of what Elon student newsrooms look like.
Wow, I had no idea that you were shifted.
Oh yeah, we were the traveling Pendulum newsroom, yeah.
That's amazing. So during your time at Elon, you worked on the Pendulum. You were the managing editor. Can you talk about what your experience was like working on it, and how did that translate to your professional career?
Yeah, so I started off as a reporter. I was a senior reporter, and as part of that, I had a beat of covering the Elon. It was then the Board of Aldermen. It's the Town Council, and that was such a great experience, just having my first opportunity to cover local government, which is something I would go on to do in my career. And then I became the managing editor, and as part of that was part of making some of our coverage decisions. And then the Pendulum had an editorial board, and we as a newspaper would take positions on issues related to campus. And it was a really great opportunity to work on the skills of just thinking through what it means to have news judgment and deciding what stories should run and how we should frame them and how we should deploy our resources and what our reporters should be focused on. When you have limited people and you have a lot of stuff going on campus, or sometimes maybe it's a slow week on campus and you have to fill the newspaper and you have to decide what stories to come up with, even though there aren't a lot of events that week, or even though there's exams and not everyone can take part. And so it was really great opportunity to get that hands-on experience at the student level, which of course just prepared me for being able to think on my feet in the job and to have good news judgment when sometimes it's up to you to decide in the moment what you need to ask someone next in the interview or where the story should go in a breaking news situation.
Mm-hmm. And so you're from Elon, you've moved to Tennessee, and now you're based in based in DC. So how have all these places impacted you and helped you grow as a journalist?
Every job built upon the next. So my first job being at the Times News in Burlington, when I was covering cops and I was covering local government, and it really just taught me these fundamental skills of what it means to talk to people, to be able to do an interview like this. Of course, you do a lot of that on campus, but a lot of times you're talking to students or faculty. And so when you get out into the real world and you go into communities that are overtaken by violent crime, or you talk to people from a religious background that maybe you never had encountered before, or you talk to people from both sides of the political spectrum who are really passionate about issues that maybe never came up as issues on campus. It was just an incredible experience. And then from there I went to the Tennessean, where I started off covering breaking news like I had done in North Carolina, but then quickly pivoted to covering state politics, which was I learned a lot. I never covered politics before then. And so covering the state legislature, covering a governor, covering campaigns, it was a blast. And that's what inspired me to want to cover politics at the national level. And I ended up sending a series of cold emails and calls to editors in DC, and I would use my existing network friends I knew in DC who knew reporters at different outlets, and just started asking people how I could get connected, and eventually landed a job at Politico. I was covering Senate campaigns there, and then went on to cover the 2024 presidential election, and now here I am covering the Trump White House.
And do you want to stay in DC, or could you see yourself moving back to North Carolina or going someplace else?
DC is a place that has so much opportunity. I see myself being there for now. It's the best place you can be if you want to be in political journalism. There are obviously so many stories to tell there, and I think the best reporters who are based in DC get out of DC a lot, so that's always something that I want to do, and something that I was really glad I got to do when I first moved to DC, because I was covering Senate campaigns. So I was going all over the country, and it was a good way to stay grounded in how people outside of DC feel about it. But I could see myself leaving DC at some point. Having moved to Nashville for work, that ended up being a city that I loved living in, and it was a lot of fun, and I made incredible connections there. And to this day, I know the mayor of Nashville, and I know the governor of Tennessee, and that all sort of happened just from being active in a community. And so, yeah, I see myself being in DC for now, but who knows what the future would be.
Mm-hmm. And so you've covered Senate campaign races, you've covered the Republican primary races. I can only assume the amount of traveling that you've had to do in the past 2-3 years. What was that like, and how did that impact your writing process, you as a person, your health, anything like that?
Yeah, well, I definitely got plenty of American Airlines miles, so those have come in handy. But yeah, you're living out of suitcase for some period of time. I think there was a 3-week period where I never went home during January of 2024, going from the Iowa caucuses to the New Hampshire primary to South Carolina primary, and you're on the road a lot. And so when I was covering campaigns, I was traveling all over the country to corners of the country that I would have never thought to go to, like small communities in Iowa and Michigan and all sorts of places. Covering the White House, there's travel involved. A lot of it is going on international trips at times. I just went with President Trump on his trip to Asia. And so on the one hand, covering campaigns, I got to see the country. Covering the White House, I get to see the world sometimes. So there's a lot of incredible opportunities, but you have to work. It's not a vacation. You have to work the whole time, which means lots of times working from hotel rooms and staying up really late and waking up really early and having plans to use the hotel gym and never having time to. But yeah, that's part of it.
And was there a specific stop that you remember best, or a story from the trail that you enjoy reminiscing about?
I loved, showing up in these new towns and finding someone who could teach me the lay of the land, which was often somebody from one of the local political parties. And these are people who, they don't spend a lot of time talking to big city reporters. And so they're really eager to tell you what you need to know about the political dynamics in a place, or what is the best restaurant to go to find people to talk to. And then in the process, you'll find this really great, if you're in Iowa, this really great pork tenderloin restaurant or something like that. The town watering hole, where you can sort of get a sense of how people are feeling just by listening to their conversations and asking them questions. But, that was something I always really enjoyed on the campaign trail. And then, of course, just the range of campaign events you're going to see, ranging from, Trump rallies where people have been standing outside in the heat and the cold for hours, and there's thousands of them, to going to an event with candidate Asa Hutchinson, who maybe would draw 2 people literally. And so you really see a wide spectrum of events, and you can have fun with that in your coverage. You can reflect the stark imbalance in how campaigns are performing, and that's sort of the fun of being on the campaign trail.
Mm-hmm. And you've been covering politics for some time. Were you always planning to go into political reporting, or is it just something that you kind of fell into?
I definitely didn't know off the bat I wanted to be a political reporter. I just wanted to be a reporter. I wanted to tell stories. And for me, what that looked like at the start was telling stories in my very community, in the community where I grew up. And, it's not something you want to discount, because I got to tell really important stories that would change local policy, and stories that would shine the light on issues where I would get feedback from people in the community saying, thank you for reporting on this. I didn't know this was a problem. Here's what we're going to try to do now to address it. And I think that was so important. And I was always curious about being a political reporter, so it was sort of natural that I found my way into it. But I don't discount the process of getting there and the stories I was able to tell along the way. And so I would encourage anybody who you think you have a certain area of journalism you want to focus on, that's a great goal to have, but be open to maybe other beats along the way because you can learn a lot from them.
During your time in Tennessee, you exposed unused federal grants. Can you talk about getting that story and what went into investigating and publishing that story?
Yeah, so it was a story that we were able to tell the Tennessean about. The state of Tennessee was essentially sitting on about $740 million of unused TANF grants, that's temporary assistance for needy families. That's federal dollars that are intended to go towards poor working families to help them get back on their feet, cover bills, but work towards finding work in the process. And the state just wasn't using them. They were piling up over the course of years. They hadn't been spent. They hadn't been dispersed in the ways that they really could help the people they were intended for. And I was tipped off to this by it was actually a local conservative, libertarian-leaning, fiscally conservative watchdog group, which is not maybe the group you would think of exposing the Republican state government for mishandling funds, but in that case, that's what it was. And they were able to point me in the right direction, and I told the story, and it led to basically a series of government officials, after initially trying to ignore the story, the Tennessean just kept telling it, and we kept finding new angles to tell it and to dive into the data, eventually to the point where the governor and lieutenant governor and legislative leadership said, okay, fine, you're right, the law should probably change. We should change this. We should change the way we're dealing with these funds. And the legislature ended up passing a law saying we have to spend down this money. And so it was such a great example of the power of local news, the power of holding powerful people accountable and telling a story over and over sometimes, if you have to drive the point home that, people in the community now, after reading this, are calling for action. So what are you going to do as people in power? And sometimes the answer isn't immediate change, and community will continue to speak out about it. Stakeholders will speak out about it. And a lot of times, if you're persistent in coverage, it's going to force change.
And what were the Confederate reckoning stories?
So when I was, I've covered Confederate issues, if you will, the neo-Confederate movement in different forms. When I was in Burlington, it was around the time of the 2016 election, there was this reemergence of what was called a neo-Confederate group, Alamance County Taking Back Alamance County, that essentially wanted to celebrate their Confederate heritage. They would hold rallies where they would wave Confederate battle flags, and they were fighting for Confederate monuments to be erected and for Confederate battle flags to be raised on the side of interstates. And it was a movement that, a lot of people felt didn't speak for their history, and people of color and people who maybe weren't from the South and didn't feel like that was representative of their views. And so there was a clash between those two groups, and I would interview the leadership and I would cover the rallies and make it known about how people on both sides of that issue felt at a time where there was a change in Washington as well. And then when I got to the Tennessean, I was part of a project of where we looked at how local towns were grappling with this idea of what do we do with Confederate monuments. You had groups that were calling for them to be preserved, or in some cases maybe even erected in the first place. And then you had groups reflecting the African American community, for example, who were speaking out about how harmful and hurtful they were to them. And at the Tennessean, I covered the long saga of the bronze bust of a Confederate general who was an early Ku Klux Klan leader that had been on display in the state capitol for a really long time. And Black lawmakers had been speaking out for many years about how they wanted to come down. They didn't feel comfortable having a white supremacist leader on display in the Capitol. And Republican leadership had resisted it for a while, until after a lot of coverage of this issue and posing the question over and over and over to state lawmakers, the governor finally said, yeah, I think it should come down. And past governors had said that too, but they hadn't gone the step of whipping votes on the state commission that would vote on what's allowed to be there. And so that governor said, no, the right thing to do is to whip the votes and to instruct the people on this commission to vote to take it down. And that finally happened in Tennessee after many, many decades of people attempting to do that. And so that was a coverage area that sort of followed me from newspaper to newspaper, particularly being in the South, because it was an issue that kept coming up, and that I was able to tell from different perspectives in the community.
And recently you did a story about Trump pardoning the former Tennessee House Speaker. How did your previous experience covering Tennessee help you write that story, and was it kind of like a full circle moment almost?
It was very full circle. It was this unexpected convergence of a beat in Nashville that I thought was long behind me, and now covering the White House. But one of my first big stories when I was covering the Tennessee State Legislature was the ouster of the House Speaker. Not related to the reasons he was charged federally, but he went on, after he was kicked out of leadership in scandal, he went on to get charged federally for a corruption case involving a way he was making money. And that case had sort of lingered for years until he was convicted just this September and sentenced to prison time, and was about to report to prison this month when Trump pardoned him and his former chief of staff. And so, it's this great example of how all the things you cover along the way, all the experiences you have, the beats you have, maybe in some cases you sort of get lucky, and not lucky, but you have the opportunity to write about them again when you're in a new job. But for the most part, all the stories you cover, you learn something from, and you learn not just about journalism and how to become better at what you're doing, but you learn something new about people, and you learn something new about the world. And so all of those things are really helpful. And then sometimes, like in the case of me recently, you just have this weird convergence of things that you thought were long in the past with things that come up now with what you're covering.
Yeah. And so you've gone from covering local to state and now national news. What are some of the differences in covering these levels? Do you prefer one over the other?
So I will say, covering the White House it's a dream job. It's what a political reporter could only dream of. Covering, the most powerful politician in the country, you could argue, in the world. And I don't take that lightly. I don't take that for granted. I worked hard to get here, and I do feel grateful for that opportunity. But local news is so much fun. I had so much fun in local news and working for a state level newspaper. There are so many opportunities to tell stories where if you don't tell that story, maybe no one else would. And that means there is the potential to affect change in ways that is so important. Whereas, on the White House beat, most of the stories you're telling, a lot of people are telling those stories, and a lot of people are chasing those stories. But one of the big differences is, of course, when you're in local news, state level news, there's a lot of room to tell stories that no one else is chasing. And I think that's really important, and that's something a lot of days that I do miss about local news.
And you've been covering national news with Politico and now with the Washington Post. But then you've done these investigative pieces like the Tennessee Federal Funds story. Do you still have that same ability to pitch and work on these longer form stories?
Yeah, it's a balance. It's, of course, our editors want us to have these blockbuster stories and, bust something wide open through an investigative piece, but that takes time. And especially in DC now, when so much is happening at the White House, when there's a flurry of activity, if it's executive orders or just something the president is saying or doing, we have to cover that too. So it's a balance between staying on top of the news of the day, in some cases trying to get ahead of it by predicting where things are going to go and signaling to your readers what's next, but also carving out time for enterprise stories. And I think the Washington Post, they want us to be able to do both, and they try to give us time to do both. But that is a tough balance when there's just so much news happening every day.
Do you think being based in DC, you have more opportunity to hear some of these stories that you could go deeper in, or is it more? Were you able to do that more in state coverage because you were the only voice basically there?
I think there's, at the federal level, there's probably just so much you can unpack in terms of potential corruption and misuse of resources. But when you're covering local news and covering state level things, I think in many ways you're expected to just have a wider outlook on what you cover. Whereas in DC, you probably have more of a narrow beat, like I cover the White House, or I cover the Hill, or I cover the Supreme Court. Those are sort of normal beats for people in DC. Whereas when you're in local government, a lot of times your beat can sort of be all over the place. Like maybe your main job is to cover city government or state government, but there's so much to go around, not enough people in the newsroom, that there are opportunities to do investigative stories on sometimes seemingly really random issues that wouldn't necessarily have their own beat. And so I think that is also sort of the bright side of being in local news, is you can kind of be open to covering a range of things.
And what was the transition like going from Politico to the Washington Post? They're both national outlets based in DC, but was there any differences or changes that you had to adjust to?
The Washington Post is obviously a storied institution. Politico, it's been around for 20 years now, so not quite a startup, but just, going from someplace that, and in some ways had this startup kind of mentality and was a little bit more flexible in what we were. And in some ways, Politico, I think, has its own question of, are we this institution now in DC, or are we still this new kind of flexible idea of what news is? But the Washington Post has been around for a really long time and has a lot of history behind it. So it was kind of nice to go back to a newspaper where it is from this more traditional model. Of course, the Post, on the other hand, is also trying to figure out what it means to be in this digital age, and what it means to have video content, and what it means to work with influencers and things like that. So I think regardless of what kind of news outlet you're at right now, if it's somewhere that's been around a long time or somewhere that's been around a couple decades, everyone is trying to figure out how to get the most readers in a way that's responsible. That's definitely the case for both of those outlets. And so figuring out the difference of how do we grow our audience online without just being clickbaity, it's really important. And so I think that's something that across the board, Politico, the Washington Post, the New York Times, The Hill, any place like that is trying to figure out right now.
A lot of the stories you've done have been in the Post have been collaborated with other reporters. How does that impact your writing process?
It's a great way to bring together people who have different sets of sources and expertise. The people on my team, they come from different reporting backgrounds. So we've all found our way into the White House team now, but my colleagues, some of them used to be on the national security team, or the technology team, or the healthcare team, or the local DC Metro team. And so they all come with these sources that I don't have. I don't know, fine points of policy on some of these issues. And then in my case, I've covered campaigns when maybe they haven't, and I've been steeped in MAGA world when they haven't. And so we can kind of all come together and bring different sets of sourcing to a story, different perspectives, different ways of approaching the story. And so that's a really helpful tool to have to not only expand the level of expertise in the story, but to even work faster. If it's just up to one person, it could take a bit longer, but when you have everyone doing interviews, you can move faster sometimes.
Is there anything else that you'd like to add that you think is important for people to know?
I would encourage everyone who is interested in a career in news and journalism, take part in student media when you're on campus. Maybe that's getting involved in ENN or writing at the Pendulum. But that was one of the most important things I did on campus. It taught me skills that helped me get an internship, which helped me get a first job, which just helped me be a better reporter. So student media is great.
That was my last question. Thank you so much for sitting down and talking with ENN.
Yeah, it was so great. Thanks for having me.